I will talk today about SERGHEI. This is a code that we've been developing together with a growing group of people since 2019. So it's still rather young. And let's say what brings us together here, of course, it's obvious, is that it's a Kokkos-based development. So for today, I'd like to basically give an overview of what SERGHEI can do, how the development is going, and what we've learned about performance portability and the HPC capabilities of SERGHEI. So hopefully you'll get a nice overview, and we can spawn a nice discussion. Oh, now I have to manage to, there we go. Now it works. So what is SERGHEI? Well, SERGHEI actually stands for something. It stands for Simulation Environment for Geomorphology, Hydrodynamics, and Ecohydrology in integrated form. So as this hints, it's really kind of a framework that couples different broad components or submodels, or however you want to call them, that are sketched out in this picture here. Originally at the core was the shallow water solver, this SWE module. And we've progressively added new modules like the Richards solver, the Lagrangian particle transport, and currently we're working on the release candidate to release the suspended sediment transport and advection dispersion solvers. So I'll come to these modules in a bit. Of course, what underlies all of this is that we rely on Kokkos to be our performance portability framework. And this is really central because this is essentially a big gap that our community, whether you want to call it computational hydrodynamics or computational hydrology or the intersection of both, kind of lacks. So having really performance portable solvers and scalable solvers and the intersection of these two things. So this is kind of the gap that we're trying to fill. And Kokkos was already back in 2019, seemed like the right choice for this. It was a bit of a bet, as I'm sure you're all aware. And you know, Kokkos is kind of developed into kind of a nice, stable, reliable project. So we're very happy that I think we bet on the right horse. So anyway, yeah, so we've released so far 3 modules, the shallow water Richards and LPT modules. One of them is still in review, so I don't show the paper here, but you can find all of this in our code, which is hosted on GitLab. And I will not explicitly say this throughout the presentation, but of course, there's a lot of acknowledgement to go to my co-developers and co-authors, most of them who are listed in this list of co-developers, who are really very much active developers, all of them. So what's the original motivation that underlies SERGHEI Shallow Water Solver? It's stuff like this. So this is a nice paper that was published a few years ago in which there was a bit of a community review that showed that despite the great advances in hydrodynamics and two-dimensional shallow water solvers for flood purposes, for example, the community was still reluctant in using it. And mainly the issue was the computational power. That, you know, people claim, oh, it's still too expensive, it's too slow, and we can't do it. So we thought, well, you know, there are GPU codes available, there's scaling codes available. What's going on that people cannot really do this? And of course, part of it is availability. So if we take a look at what was available back in 2019, 2020, 2021, in terms of open sourced or at least freeware solvers, which have not been traditionally the case in this community, we actually see that there's a lot of software available. But only a few of these were actually at the time GPU enabled, and only one of them was actually scaling. And this was Triton, which is mainly developed at Oak Ridge. At the time, Triton was not capable of using any other GPU infrastructure except NVIDIA GPUs. And now it can also reach AMD GPUs, as far as I understand. But we thought, well, you know, we can take a step forward and move towards portability. And that's kind of where the motivation came from. Now, to give you an idea of what SERGHEI can do, I'm just here showing a simulation of a flood event that happened close by to where I'm in Jülich, here in Germany, in 2021. If you're in Europe, you may remember this event. It was all over the news. And you have some pictures there below how it looks. So this is the type of things that you can expect from SERGHEI. You know, essentially, very high resolution flood modeling. So what I'm showing there is 1 meter resolution model of this entire area, and this was solved on 8 NVIDIA A100 GPUs with a very reasonable time. which that's not the point here, but indeed we have shown that SERGHEI is usable for these purposes, like to flood modeling at scale. Inside of the shallow water solver, what we have is kind of a well-established scheme. If you're unfamiliar with the shallow water equations, this is what there is on the top left. It's basically a hyperbolic system that solves for water pressure and water velocity, and it has a few source terms to account for the effect of gravity, the slope of the terrain, friction, and potentially mass source terms such as rain and infiltration or exfiltration. We discretize this with finite volume scheme, a first order finite volume scheme, and we do explicit time integration, which will translate into very nice scalability, as you will see. And we write it in this kind of convoluted way, which I will not get into the details, but essentially represents the hyperbolic solution in terms of waves. And we include a nice wave strength term, alpha, which is rather common in linearization schemes, and this beta term, which accounts for the source terms. So this is kind of the fundamental numerical strategy that we use in SERGHEI, which is not new in that sense. It exists in other solvers. We've just implemented it in SERGHEI in an efficient way. If you're not familiar with what this means, essentially what we're doing is a Godunov type explicit upwind first order scheme. Godunov in the sense that we integrate in finite volumes in space, and we compute fluxes across edges of cells, solving local Riemann problems. And then, of course, we integrate the time derivative forward in time with a first order explicit Euler scheme. That's essentially it. So it's nothing particularly fancy in that sense. Now, in terms of the implementation, I'd like to say that SERGHEI actually has quite nice, interesting features. So, of course, it's performance portable via Kokkos, and it has a hybrid parallelization relying on MPI. As I said, we used an augmented Riemann solver that takes into account the source terms. And it is CFL constrained in terms of the time step. This has implications, as I will show in further slides. And we have shown already that it's kind of exascale ready. I'll show some plots a little bit later. Now, there's some things that are still in its infancy in SERGHEI. For example, the domain decomposition is still rather naive. It's 2D blockwise, so we can't do really fancy domain decomposition. It's not implemented in that way, at least. We're working a lot on dynamic load balancing and also working on adaptive grids. Mixed precision computing, which may come in handy for particular purposes. And on the most exotic side, we work on malleability, that is dynamical use of computational resources, and in situ visualization. So I will not show details on all of this, but I wanted to kind of give an overview of where the project is going. So I will focus now first on the shallow water module, which we use for these type of flood modeling scenarios. And early on, what we were most interested in being able to show and to show to ourselves as well was the portability between CPUs and GPUs. So the plot on the left nicely shows this scaling plot for CPU and GPU systems here in Jülich, and also consumer grade GPUs. And you may think, well, why are you concerned about this? Well, because this is a community that still has a lot of non-HPC users. I would say most of our users are non-HPC users. So they actually care about performance on consumer-grade GPUs. But of course, this comes for free in our portability exercises, and it's just being shown. Essentially, the performance is quite good, comparable, if not better, than things that are published around here in the STEM community. And of course, early on, we showed reasonably good scalability for a given problem. This is a standard benchmark, what you have on the right. It's a dam break, a circular dam break, and this scaled very, very nicely across a large number of GPUs. Now, we've tested this also with real problems. So in this case, it's a catchment in the US. And this type of simulation is essentially rain on this catchment, and we see what happens, how these streams form, how the rivers flood in, and so on. And we were also very, very happy with the scalability, as you can see both on CPU and GPU plots in our Jewel system here in Jülich and the already decommissioned summit at Oak Ridge. And this was doing quite some nice work across these systems. Now, more recently, with the upcoming Jupiter, which is physically installed already in Jülich, but not we're not allowed to use it yet, not quite. We've started testing, of course, how the scalability is looking. So yet again here, what you're seeing are scalability plots for the benchmark dam break problem for a number of systems in Jülich. So I've talked before about Yuval's booster, which are the blue curves here. And we also have Eureka DC, which is somewhere in the red curves, and JEDI, which is the precursor of Jupiter. It's essentially one rack of Jupiter that is now decommissioned. It has been ingested by the Jupiter system. And we've already corroborated that this JEDI system of future Jupiter based on Grace Hopper super chips is following the same type of scalability. And we already know that the speed up is going to be somewhere between 1.8 and 1.9 roughly for our solver. So as soon as we have access to Jupiter, we will actually be able to demonstrate that. Now, why all this concern about scalability and performance in this context, and where is this going? So a big interest with the SERGHEI SWE, let's say this module, is flash flood simulation. So here again, I'm showing an animation of the flood event from 2021 that I previously showed, except that what you were seeing before was just this little chunk on the top right, so in the downstream area where the floodplain is. And in this simulation, it's rain over the entire catchment, so it's about 900 square kilometers. And we've forced this with radar measured precipitation. So this is really in the science side. Now, the interesting bit from the HPC side is what's the performance of this for different resolutions. Now, for flash flood early warning, of course, lead times are essential. And our concern is to understand what is the optimal resolution and what is the optimal computational efficiency, or what is the computational constraints, how do they allow us to have a reasonable forecast with as high resolution as possible. So just simply trying these exercises, what we realize is for very high resolution, say 1 meter, we run roughly about 4 times faster than real time, which is good, but it's potentially a bit slow. And I should say this is all in Yuval, so these are A100 GPUs. And this requires quite some resources in the order of 128 A100s. If we work at 2 meter resolution, now we can run roughly, let's say, up to 18 times faster than real time, which becomes a very, very good result for decision making, for example. But it still relies on quite a large number of GPUs. So there's this big trade-off, of course, with resolution. And it's mostly motivated not by the resolution itself, but the effect that it has on the CFL. So I mentioned this before. We basically have a linear increase of the computational cost because of the linear decrease of the time step with resolution. And because we cannot parallelize this, we cannot offload it onto more GPUs, then that is essentially the bottleneck. The nice thing, of course, is that the solver is scalable enough. So the strong scalings you saw earlier allow us to really play a lot with the number of resources. And we can, even if the parallel efficiency is dropping at some point, say, for example, beyond 96 GPUs for the 2 meter case, we can still gain a little bit of time. So arguably, there is still something to be done in terms of accelerating these potential early warning simulations. And of course, as I said before, this is just going faster as we move to the next generation of GPUs. So we expect that for 1 meter in Jupiter, this is going to be in the order of 8 or 9 times faster than real time, which is pretty good. Now, there's, as I said, still open issues. So when I look at the GPU usage of this simulations I was just showing, this is for the 1 meter case. So 128 GPUs, and these are mapped into this heat map on the vertical axis, time is on the horizontal axis. What you're fundamentally seeing is that there is a load imbalance in space. I should say that the domain decomposition in this case is of basically vertical stripes across the whole domain of equal size. So as it becomes obvious from looking at the shape of the catchment, the central parts of the domain have most of the load. So evidently this requires some kind of rebalancing to get better results in space already, but you can also see that in time there's increases and decreases of load. So there is a real need for dynamic load balancing for these cases. And although the spatial part we know a priori because we know the geometry of the domains, the dynamic part in how the rainfall is moving back and forth and which parts are active and inactive, we don't really know. So those have to be determined during runtime. This is still a work in progress, so there's no results to show in terms of dynamic load balancing, but it is on its way because it is kind of a bottleneck right now, aside from the CFL issue I mentioned, which doesn't really have a solution. Now, another bit of kind of really esoterical work that we're doing in this direction is expanding on dynamic load balancing into dynamic resources. So essentially, not only changing the size of our subdomains, but changing the number of our subdomains and mapping each of those subdomains to a potentially different number of computational resources. Now, the concept is straightforward, right? I may start a job with 2 subdomains and therefore 2 CPUs or 2 GPUs, and this might change in time to fewer the compositions and fewer resources or to more, as you see in this figure. This is a lot of experimental work that we're carrying out collaboratively with Barcelona Supercomputing Centre and the University of Zaragoza in Spain. And it's kind of nice. We have a proof of concept. So here you have a couple of other examples of additional test cases where we have this working. What we don't have yet is the heuristics of how we make these decisions to make dynamic resource configurations, but this is essentially on its way, and it goes hand in hand with the dynamic load balancing. So essentially, the same decisions that need to be made for dynamic load balancing can be extended into this. From a technical point of view, this works together with a library called libDMR that is developed by our colleagues in Barcelona. And I will not go into the details, but essentially what this allows us to do is that in our SERGHEI code, in our initialization, we write some hyperparameters that control how we want to do the shrinking or expansion of the computational resource set, and we provide basically callback functions in SERGHEI to express how the memory, our data, has to be moved around once we repartition the domain, and which GPU gets which chunk of our domain essentially. It's kind of minimally invasive. It's really nice. So we have to do this at initialization time. And of course, there is at some point in the main time loop, we have to trigger this reconfiguration. And this, again, basically calls the same kind of callback functions. All right. So one further point on the shallow water module that we're kind of proud is that I think we can claim that we have reached exascale readiness. These are still unpublished results. They've been submitted, and this is work primarily done by my colleague Johannes Villalobos from the CNCA, and together with Silvio Risi from Argonne National Lab. And it's really nice because we can show very good scalability, both strong scaling and weak scaling for SERGHEI SWE on NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel GPUs. So specifically on Jules and Jedi here, not Jupiter just yet, because as I said, we don't have any access to it, but also on Frontier and in Aurora. So 2 of the 4 exascale systems essentially are already represented in this plot, and I think this is quite an achievement that we can be proud of. This is, though, only for the shallow water module, so the work needs to be done also for the other modules and verify that this holds, that the scalability holds, and of course we expect that the portability will work out because it is mostly Kokkos what's working underneath. So finally, I'd like to show very quickly, how the profile of SERGHEI shallow water looks like, and this is done with Insight Systems and on Juvels here in Jülich. This is, I should mention, it's also our dam break problem, so it's kind of the standard thing that we do all our benchmarking in. And a typical profile looks like this. I think what is what should be a typical trace, I should say. The thing that I highlight the most is that the actions on unified memory are really a low percentage of the time. And this is what we wanted to verify mostly, that the memory movements that were being done were actually being done smartly, and we're not generating a big overhead. And this we kind of verify. So as we zoom into the trace, it becomes quite apparent where the memory movements are happening, and it's mostly through I/O, as you can see here on the I/O block. If we zoom in into the time steps, we basically see very, very little memory movements between them. And as we zoom into the kernels themselves, which we can distinguish here, we have two types of kernels, essentially edge-based kernels which compute the Riemann problems, and cell updates which add up the contributions. And you clearly see which ones are the most expensive ones, which are the Riemann solvers, as expected. And this, of course, is nicely summarized. So all in all, the traces kind of confirm what we expected and are satisfying in terms of performance. Now I will now move to rather quickly through the other modules in SERGHEI, and with a little bit less of detail, mainly because they are less mature. So these have been developed and released later. The second one of them is the Richards equation solver, which represents subsurface flow. So the shallow water solver we use for the surface, and for the subsurface we can use the Richards equation solver. It solves this parabolic elliptic equation that you have on the right side. And if you're familiar with these types of equations, you know they're a bit nasty because they misbehave a lot when they change from the parabolic to the elliptic regime. So the discretization strategy is pretty similar. We use a first-order finite volume discretization, and here very purposely I do not write the full discretization with the time derivative, because we've left ourselves a bit of choice of working with the rather traditional fully implicit approach, in which we discretize this implicitly and write a linearization scheme using, let's say, for example, a Newton scheme that later has to invert a linear system several times in a time step until it achieves convergence of the linearization procedure and then advances in time. So this is the right workflow here, this NR workflow, which at the core, as I said, has some kind of linear solver. We actually we prefer to use in SERGHEI this so-called PC, or predictor corrector scheme, that you have on the left. So if you look fundamentally at the loops in these schemes, what you see is that the PC scheme has one nice advantage, is that it only inverts the matrix once. So it still has to write a linear system and invert it, but only once, and not an unpredictable number of times as the Newton scheme. And this is of interest because in this way we reduce the relevance of the linear solver, which is likely not to have as nice strong scaling features as what we have, for example, in the shallow water solver, which is fully explicit. And of course, we've gone through very nice validation of these schemes, and this is just to very shallowly show that the different schemes that we're using actually are correct. So it's a bit of innovation in that sense. Traditionally, the fully implicit scheme has been preferred for the last, I would say, 30 years in this community, at least in production codes, and we're quite happy with the predictor corrector scheme, which seems to achieve good results. Now, when we take this to scalability, here I'm only showing scalability of the predictor corrector scheme. Now we get quite nice strong scalability, as you can see on both CPU and GPU plots. You should keep in mind that these plots are done with cases of different size, of course. So it's a smaller problem for the CPUs than for the GPUs, so they're not 100% comparable. And we see also, the expected behavior across GPUs. Now, you do see that in the GPU plots here on the bottom right, we also show results for the implicit scheme. So this one is the one with the crosses, and this one has a significantly higher runtime. And this is essentially because of this process of linearization and having to invert a linear system on every time step. So the point in this plot is to say, well, this predictor corrector scheme has an advantage in terms of runtime. It has some issues, let's say, sometimes with guaranteeing local mass conservation, but that is also a little bit the case with implicit schemes. So there's an argument of why we should at least have fair comparisons between both at scale, because essentially with a small set of resources, it may be, or with a low level of parallelization, it may be that that the predictor corrector scheme is not as good because it requires many more time steps, but the implicit one requiring less time steps may be fast enough at low problems that are small enough, let's say.
We have a question in the chat. Someone is asking whether SHPM means shared memory hierarchical process mapping.
Sorry, can you repeat?
SHPM is shared memory hierarchical process mapping.
Sorry, this was back here, I believe, right? No, I did not mention this, but it stands for simulation hours per minute. It's just a metric of how you would use this in reality. So 10, this means, this 25 meters, the simulation is either 600 times faster than real time, or basically you get 10 simulation hours per minute. Sorry, it nothing to do with that.
Thank you.
Right. So I would move on then to the next module, which is our Lagrangian solver. And for motivation, I show this video on the left. This is a flood that happened in Zaragoza, where my colleagues work a couple of years ago. And it's, it's kind of scary and massive how you see just from rainfall. This is not a river overflooding. This is rainfall that accumulates, creates this river in the middle of the street, and you see the cars floating away. So this kind of motivates our intention for having a Lagrangian solver. At this point, currently in the development, we're targeting essentially massless particles and small debris, stuff like microplastics. But the idea is to scale to full 3D objects that move with the floods. And of course, we want to have the same types of features. We want to be portable. We want to be scalable, and so on and so forth. What this module does is pretty straightforward. It basically solves an advection equation for the particle center of mass, if you will. But currently, as I said, we have massless and volumeless particles, so it's really a mathematical point. And we've implemented Euler-based and Runge-Kutta-based time integrators. Runge-Kutta ones are rather the standard, I would say. But we do not prefer them because we want to essentially run our Lagrangian solver online with the same time step frequency as the Eulerian solver. And the reason to do this is because we have wetting and drying across the domain. So if you've seen the animations of the previous simulations, what you see is that as the rain goes away, parts of the domain dry out, and these particles should stop moving whenever the domain dries out. If we use offline Runge-Kutta time integrators, we may lose this information, which has high spatial and temporal frequency. Currently, the LPT module, although released, is only for single GPU, so the distributed computations have not yet been implemented, but they're essentially ongoing. In a similar way, we've validated this, with some kind of standard benchmarks. So we see that the particles follow the trajectories that they should follow, and we know a little bit about the performance of the Euler and the Runge-Kutta schemes, and in terms of both of accuracy and their efficiency. What we also know is, as we expected, is that the offline Runge-Kutta scheme, the larger you make the time step, or the lower you make the frequency, you actually lose this interaction with the drying and the wetting. So for general purposes, we don't want to use this one. We want to actually use the Euler one. The online Runge-Kutta, which essentially does the same thing but with smaller time steps, it doesn't really pay off because it's more expensive. So in the end, we kind of default on the simpler scheme because it does the job. And we're currently studying how this behaves. So we have some experiments that are ongoing to try to understand. I hope you can see the particles on the top animation. You can see the velocity field on the bottom animation. And this is an interesting case because it's a steady flow, and the unsteadiness, the transientness of it, comes from the vortex shedding on these corners of the obstacles. And this actually allows us to look quite nicely at the dynamics of these particles in a fairly simple and understandable test case. What we've learned from this test case is that if we do a sufficiently refined Eulerian mesh for our hydrodynamics, our particles follow these type of trajectories like in the top plot. And these are way too smooth. I mean, this is not what you would see in an experiment in a lab of this type. And this is essentially because we're lacking dispersive effects. Typically in shallow water solvers, dispersion has been lumped with numerical viscosity or numerical dispersivity of the grid, but at sufficiently high resolution, that does not happen anymore. So in this Lagrangian model, we need to reintroduce some kind of dispersivity or turbulence model, if you will. And that's what we're showing here on the bottom plot. Now, this, we don't know what is the right solution to this, but we're essentially experimenting with this. We've also learned that by introducing this model, which is what you see here on the green box on the top right on the advection discretization of the advection equation, has a non-negligible computational cost. So we have to also try to optimize this a bit. This was a bit of a surprise for us. Now, finally, I'll talk a little bit about the latest module that will soon be released. This is the sediment transport, or I should be more specific, the suspended sediment transport module. And this basically is an enrichment of the shallow water equations with an advection dispersion equation and this dispersion equation has a source term which accounts for erosion and deposition processes. So basically some kind of reactive term in this equation. The numerical scheme for this is rather similar to the one in the shallow water solver. I will not go into the details here because at the core, it's the same idea. So also the discretization is very similar, and the implementation goes hand in hand with what we did with the shallow water solver. We have preliminary tests, or really kind of first tests, to kind of gauge how this is performing. Very nicely, what we see is that resolution is a big important thing for sediment transport simulation. So I'm comparing all the time 10 meter versus 1 meter resolution in this dam break simulation. Different fields here, so that's water depth on the left, and then on the right, it's the concentration of the sediment. Sorry, it's only water depth here, and it's at different times, and this is concentration at different times, so early on the left and later on the right. And you see clearly here the difference in structures of the sediment concentration as this progresses in time. Just to make the point or hammer the point a little bit more, this is the difference by increasing resolution by a factor 10. And I mentioned this because one of the strengths of SERGHEI, of course, it's performance and its scalability. So we are really targeting these high resolution applications. The idea is we will be able to deploy SERGHEI at, let's say, river scale or catchment scale at 1 or 2 meter resolution instead of 10 or 20 meter resolution. And this actually matters a lot more for the sediment than for the water fluxes. In terms of performance, it's also still very preliminary, and it looks a little bit like this. So we've done some scaling tests here in UVals, up to 64 GPUs with the clean shallow water solver, which is in light blue, and adding a successive number of sediment fractions. There's a big jump from no sediment to having some sediment, which we currently cannot explain, and we did not expect. So there may be some implementation issues here, how we have written this down in our solver. It probably has to do with the fact that we're not really leveraging on hierarchical parallelism in Kokkos and things like this that would probably go in very well for the sediments. But essentially, this is under investigation currently. The good thing that we see is that for a given problem size, as we increase the number of sediment classes, both the edge and cell-based computations and the, let's say, MPI exchange routines and the domain integration scale kind of properly and well. So far, so good, with the exception of this big jump, which we would want to kind of bring down. After that, it seems that like adding increasing number of sediment fractions does not substantially increase the computational cost, but yeah, remains to be properly evaluated. So with that, I'll summarize by saying that, as I said at the beginning, SERGHEI is a solver that is from scratch based on Kokkos. We're very happy that we did this. It's really providing very nice results. And we've shown that it is really performance portable and highly scaling, at the very least, and the two solvers that are actually already highly scaling. The other ones are in the pipeline. As I mentioned, a few modules have already been released. Some of them are In the release candidate, the Lagrangian one is not yet scaling, but the shallow water one has been shown really to be exascale ready and fully performance portable across all GPU vendors. We've done a fair amount of profiling. We've done some formal roofline analysis, and we see good behavior for the main shallow water kernels. But we have also identified nice optimization possibilities in these kernels to better exploit Kokkos. And one of the big bottlenecks that still remains to be tackled is the load balancing issues, which we are investigating with experiments on dynamic load balancing and malleability. And with that, I finish, and I thank you for your interest and your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Now we have some time for questions. Don't hesitate to open your microphone if you do.
I think we have a question on the chat, Thomas.
Yes. So more on the science side, I was wondering whether any interest or work is done in trying to compare real-time or streaming data with simulations. I imagine such thing cannot be fully de novo by some comparison and continuing previous similar simulations.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very interesting question. So far, we have not done this. That is kind of the goal. So the idea is that we can actually run a sufficiently large number of simulations in parallel on, let's say, during a heavy rainfall event, so that we can pretty much nowcast the flood and compare it with streaming data. That is essentially the goal. We're not quite there yet. I think we still need a couple of years more to do that. Not because of the HPC side, let's say, or even the solver side, just to build the infrastructure to do this and to gain access to this data, which is not necessarily openly available.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. Does adding dispersion change the limit on the explicit time step?
That's a great question. So the idea is no. That is what we try to do. But I cannot guarantee this at this point. We're trying to implement a dispersion term in essentially for the advection dispersion equation that avoids limiting the advective time step. So we do some kind of subcycling in it. In principle, it works. So our tests so far do not show anything that deviates horribly from the reference solutions, but we have not yet tested it thoroughly enough to guarantee that it will work in a general case. If it does work, then the answer to that question would be hopefully no, it will not limit the advective time step, which is the entire purpose of the exercise, let's say.
Pierre, do you want to ask your question yourself? So the question is, are you using GMRes or CG-Krylov solvers? I guess you are not using multi-grid preconditioner. So what are you using?
Yeah, so in the current implementation in SERGHEI, we're using GC, and that's about it. This is suboptimal, so we really need to move to something better. It's not really clear what we want to use. Probably some kind of multi-grid preconditioner. Yes, not decided yet. We're experimenting with this, and I think I wrote it down in the slide. I didn't mention it. So far we've used the Kokkos kernels implementations. We're looking into using some Trilinos implementations and figure out what works best for us. We know, like contextually from other Richard solvers, that this is a bit of an art. So getting very good performance out of these solvers for Richard's equations is often tricky, but yeah, we're essentially trying to learn from the community on what is the optimal choice. I don't have a straight out answer of what is best there. I can tell you we're using GC and that we're not happy.
And we have chat also. Can you comment on the ease of collaboration or contribution with physicists with regard to Kokkos itself and the fact that the code is in C++?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just like with the portability aspect, we're very happy that we selected Kokkos as our solution. I think also from the point of view of encapsulation and separation of concerns, that is also the case. So we are not fancy computer scientists and fancy programmers. I mean, I think we are good experienced programmers and good scientific programmers to a very good extent, but we still write code in a rather plain way. And because of that, and because of our continuous work with PhD students and a lot of people who are really unfamiliar with high levels of abstraction, HPC or GPU programming in general, we definitely need to have this separation of concerns. And I think with Kokkos we have really achieved that in SERGHEI. For the most part, the only thing that a developer would see when writing a particular module would be the kernel launch, right? So the Kokkos Parallel 4. This is pretty much what they see that looks weird, because everything else is hidden somewhere else under some aliasing, some type def definition. So they don't even see the Kokkos views. They don't see the templating. So it's really easy for them not to understand it and still manage to get it to work. It comes with a bit of a price, which is, often people who have a bit of training in parallel programming or a bit of experiencing in parallel programming, but do not really see how things are interacting in a parallel way plainly in the code, then we kind of the core developers, we have to step in and make sure that the performance is actually being delivered. But I would say in terms of productivity it's excellent. The interaction with non-expert, let's say, domain scientist developers, it's really, really good and really, really fluid.
Thank you again, Daniel. And with that, we'll conclude that we will have a break for the summer with so no Kokkos Tea time in July or August. And we will come back in September with Wolfgang Bangert that will talk about C++20 experience converting large scientific software packages written in C++ to C++20 modules that come from Colorado State University. Thank you again all, and see you in September.
Thank you, Thomas. And so in the chat, if you have a look, we have the link to register to the Kokkos mailing list. If you want to know about the next tea times, I recommend to you to go check there. And I think we have maybe 5 more minutes. I see there are new questions rising, so maybe we can take those. Pariksit or Parikshit. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm really sorry.
It's Parikshit. That's right. So I kind of had a question for Daniel. So I'm moving from like a postdoc and applying to faculty positions, and I'm just trying to get like a sense of, to maintain, like an exascale approaching project like this. I'm just trying to get an idea of like the number of students you feel is like a healthy number, or staff scientists to work on this. So like at least in like the biology side, it seems like we at least need one full-time scientist, to have continuity in the lab and maintain the code. But I'm just kind of was interested in sort of your experience, because this seems like a much larger effort than anything that I've attempted before.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think it's a hard thing to answer. You definitely need someone who is, staff scientist who will dedicate time continuously. I mean, not necessarily all the time, but will continuously dedicate time to manage the code, even if you have a large number of contributors that are doing small things. In our case, I have to say, I mean, I'm the main maintainer. I'm handling code reviews and pull requests. which is not my full-time job. It's almost my hobby, if you will. But I try to dedicate as much time as I can to it. But the rest of the developer team really also chips in significantly, to help out. I think you're actually targeting at a big strategic and structural question, right? Which is research software development is not necessarily perceived as a scientific activity in itself, but as a technical activity. So how do you justify scientists' times and not only research software engineers? And I think it's very difficult. So we do this very much we play by ear, basically. We claim that what we're doing is actually science, and what we're tackling things are science in itself. We're investigating things that we don't know how they work. Of course, it may be on the computing side. It's not necessarily natural science. And for those of us who are in the world of natural science, this is sometimes difficult to justify for our institutions. But in the terms of needs, yeah, I mean, I think you at the very least need one experienced domain scientist who understands what the code is for and what the objectives are and what is reasonable to achieve and what the priorities should be in terms of delivering features. And you need probably one full-time person who knows the technicalities and who understands performance, who understands code abstraction, who understands software engineering, CI/CD, and all these non-negligible aspects that we don't report in our papers, right? So I think that's essential. And this is a rabbit hole. I could go on this forever, but I'll stop. It's really super important that we talk about this more.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have one last question? Well, if not, let's thank Daniel again. And as Thomas said, see you all in September. Thank you, bye-bye, and please go and register for the new mailing list. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you all.